Thank you for joining us tonight for a webinar on the beauty and benefits of rain gardens. This is Paul Skawinski. I'm a lake management and water quality educator with the Extension Lakes program at UW-Stevens Point. Rain gardens are particularly interesting to me because of all the functions that they serve. They not only allow for aesthetic improvements to a property, they also capture and contain stormwater runoff from that property, improving water quality downstream by containing that water and allowing it to slowly soak in and be filtered out. And they also provide a lot of wildlife habitat for everything from pollinators to birds to other wildlife. So I consider them sort of a superstar of gardens, and I'm excited to talk to you about them tonight. This illustration shows a landscape before and after human development. What you see on the left is that there's a lot of vegetation on the landscape, and as precipitation falls, most of the energy of that falling precipitation is absorbed by the vegetation. So very little energy is remaining when it hits the soil. Erosion is not a big concern in these areas, and the landscape itself has many low spots and high spots where the water can accumulate and it can slowly soak into the ground and reach the groundwater table instead of going quickly across the surface of the land down into our lakes and rivers and wetlands that are at the bottom of the landscape. On the right side, we see a developed landscape where much of it is very flat. The land is compacted and most of the vegetation has been removed. A few large specimen trees are usually left, but much of the rest of the landscape is converted to hardscapes like roads and driveways, or converted to lawn in most cases. Since most of the landscape is not good at soaking in water anymore, a lot of that water then runs across the land very rapidly as just surface water, and it takes various pollutants with it. It'll take things like lawn clippings, dog waste, fertilizers, pesticides, other things off the landscape, and quickly direct them to our lakes and rivers and wetlands at the bottom of the landscape. Instead of being filtered through the ground and slowly moving through groundwater and then being discharged into a water body, it's very quickly moving across the land and carrying a lot of other things with it. Pollution comes from a lot of sources on a developed site. It can include things like vehicle fluids and motor oil from driveways, things from decks and patios, petroleum products from an asphalt roof, lawn clippings and dog waste off of the land, or fertilizers, pesticides. All of these things can come off of a single property, and it's best to try to contain those different pollutants before they reach the low spot, which is often a water body. The EPA did a study on water pollution and rain gardens and found that 70% of all water pollution is caused by stormwater runoff carrying these pollutants into our waterways. They also found that rain gardens were effective at removing up to 90% of nutrients and pollutants from stormwater. So it's really important as individual homeowners to help the community by capturing your own property's stormwater on site instead of sending it downstream to become a problem somewhere else. Rain gardens are low areas that are either natural in the landscape or man-made that allow you to capture water and soak it in instead of allowing it to keep flowing across the land. They should be sited at least 10 feet from any structure so that you're not ponding any water right up against the foundation of a building. They tend to decrease erosion because they are capturing that water and they're containing it instead of allowing it to run across the landscape. They decrease the stormwater pollution and volume of stormwater, which is particularly important in areas where stormwater systems might become overwhelmed. You may see water actually coming out of a storm drain instead of going in. And we have areas like the city of Milwaukee where the sanitary system, sewer system, and the stormwater sewer system are combined. And occasionally in the summer, we hear about raw sewage having to be discharged into Lake Michigan because the sewer system got so overwhelmed by a heavy storm event. So decreasing the volume of that stormwater would help to prevent situations like that from having to happen. They also increase water quality downstream, as I've already mentioned, by filtering out all those pollutants and nutrients before they can reach a waterway. Rain gardens can provide all kinds of different goals of a garden. In this case, we have a rain garden that's providing a wall of late season blooms with various aster species and black-eyed Susans and brown-eyed Susans and a couple others. They provide a lot of wildlife value for things like butterflies especially, and they can provide water quality improvements. What we see in the photo here is a landscape where it's very much lawn that is on a heavy slope, and the water runs down that lawn and accumulates at the bottom and eventually makes its way to a storm drain here. The storm drain is just a network of pipes that delivers stormwater right off the land directly to a local waterway without any kind of treatment in most cases. This is another example of a similar situation. We have two very large lawns that are fertilized. There is no vegetation in between these lawns and the lake. There are no low spots for the water to accumulate and slowly soak in. So all that water from a heavy rain will just run down the slope and be directed right into the lake here. You can see from the photo that the fertilizers on the lawn are fertilizing the lake just as well as they are the grass. The plants that you see in the foreground are it's a type of filamentous slimy algae called Spirogyra. These long threads of algae are indications of high nutrient conditions. And what you really are seeing is these towers of algae that have grown around aquatic plants. So the plants were there initially, they were then colonized by this algae and smothered out. The plants ended up dying, and what you have left over are these columns of slimy algae that are left in the water. This is another example of a similar situation. This landowner has mowed the grass and probably string trimmed the grass all the way to the water's edge, and this has allowed the water to shed off of the landscape. Lawn clippings can go in the water. The erosion of the shoreline is taking place. You can see areas that are sloughing into the lake because the root systems of the grass are just not adequate to hold the soil back. So it's fertilizing the lake, and the vegetation in the lake is extremely thick as a result of that nutrient pollution. Here's another example from a lake where we were doing an aquatic plant survey. So this was not a very fun survey to be a part of because every plant was covered in this algae. So before you could identify the types of plants that you had on the rake, you had to pull all this slimy algae off first to even see the plant. And another final shot, this is a group of algae that grows on the lake bottom and sometimes will just rot and rise up to the surface, and we get these mats of dead brown algae floating on the surface. I have too many photos from around the state like this. This illustration is showing the root systems of trees. It's hard to visualize what the root system or underground portion of a perennial plant or tree looks like, but in general, especially with trees and shrubs, the root system does tend to be about as big as the above ground portion. So they're about as wide as the drip line of the plant or the tree, and they are contain about as much biomass underground as they do above ground. Trees and shrubs can be effective components of a rain garden as well, not really within the garden, but along the edges, and they can be extremely efficient at removing pollutants and absorbing water from stormwater. This chart here shows root systems of common prairie plants of the Midwest. And what you are looking at on the left and right sides of the illustration here is a scale in feet of how deep the roots can reach. And so you can see that a lot of these prairie plants can reach down many, many feet in order to reach water. And so they require very little maintenance when they're used in landscaping because they don't care if we have a drought. They can reach down far enough to find their own water. They have large root systems that can find nutrients as they need them. So they don't need a lot of maintenance as far as irrigation or fertilization or anything goes. The plant on the left is Kentucky bluegrass or common turfgrass species. The root system of Kentucky bluegrass is a matter of a few inches deep, so it does not survive well. It needs irrigation and fertilization in order to thrive. Kentucky bluegrass is not a native species to Wisconsin. It belongs in areas where it's very cool and moist year round. That's where it likes to be. So that explains why we have healthy grass in the springtime and in the fall, but in the middle of summer, the grass turns brown and goes dormant because it's not really meant for that kind of condition. So let's make a rain garden. This is sort of an ideal situation here. We're gonna pretend we have a flat area that is covered in turf right now. So we don't have any big woody plants and to get rid of or anything like that. It's a fairly easy site and a common situation in urban environments where a lot of the land is fairly flat and covered in turf. So the first thing we need to do is just dig a depression in the landscape. So this soil can either be taken away, it can be relocated somewhere else on the property. You could use it to build up a berm on the outside of the garden, but for this purpose, for the illustration here, we're just gonna pretend we took the soil somewhere else. Then we're gonna add some compost to the bottom, just a few inches of nice compost. We're gonna mix that in to create a nice, rich planting bed to put our plants into. And then we're going to put our plants in. I also like to put borders around rain gardens. They really just give it a finished look and kind of contain everything within it. The picture here shows sweet black-eyed Susans along the fringes. The rain garden is not a pond and it's not always wet. So you do have to consider that the plants you put in a rain garden are a combination of moisture-loving species at the bottom and drier species along the edges because it's not wet all the time, and especially the edges, the upper edges, will dry out frequently. So you need to consider plants that can tolerate that. The species that you put along the outside of the rain garden should be the ones that you would put in anywhere else in your landscape. Pretending we don't have a rain garden here anymore, whatever you would plant into your soil in other situations, those are the plants that you should put along the sides of the rain garden. When you get to the bottom, you can start thinking about moisture-loving plants like some sedges, blue flag iris, as you see in the picture here, cardinal flower, things like that. So now we have to get the water to the garden. I like to use downspouts. I often help people put rain gardens in that are fairly close to the house. So a simple downspout extension can deliver the water directly to the rain garden. And it's also important to put a pad of rocks, we call it a splash pad, in front of the downspout so that the water coming out doesn't erode away any soil as it falls. It hits the rocks and those rocks absorb the energy from that water coming out of the downspout. So then the water comes out and it starts to fill in the garden, watering all your plants. And if it's raining hard enough, it will start to pond in the rain garden. One of the misconceptions of rain gardens is that they hold water for a long time and they breed mosquitoes. And that is not true. Most mosquitoes need at least 7 days as a larva in the water before they can hatch out as an adult mosquito. So unless you're holding water for a week or more, you're not breeding any mosquitoes in a rain garden. In central Wisconsin, where I live, the sandy soils here can drain water extremely quickly. So even though my rain garden at home is about 14 inches deep at the deepest spot, it can fill up all the way and drain completely within a few hours. So it does not take very long. Even in heavier soils, you're not likely to see water ponding in the rain garden for more than a day or two. What's more likely is that if you're holding water for a day or two, you will trick some mosquitoes into laying eggs in that water, and the larvae will simply not hatch out of the egg, or will just dry up as the rain garden dries. So it could actually reduce mosquito populations in your area. And then you add your final touches. We have a toad house with our little resident toad here making his screen debut. So you can choose whatever you'd like to add to your rain garden as a final touch. I always tell people to design their gardens to meet their desires. Don't just put a few plants in because you saw them at the store. Think about what you want to get out of this garden, and maybe you have multiple goals that you can accomplish at the same time with this garden. You may want to attract butterflies, or maybe you want to attract birds. Maybe you are trying to treat stormwater, which rain garden is obviously a good choice. Maybe you're looking to screen a sidewalk or a driveway or a porch or a play set or something like that. You may be able to accommodate many of these goals into one garden design. In our case, we were trying to create a butterfly paradise and also a butterfly viewing area for us from the porch and from the living room window, which is right there along the rain garden. So our rain garden drains about 1,100 square feet of rooftop through a single oversized downspout. We have oversized gutters and a single large downspout that takes all that water and puts it into the rain garden. The garden itself is about 280 square feet. It's designed as a screen for part of the house and for the porch, and as I said, for butterfly viewing. This is a picture from the beginning as we were starting to dig. I did hire a landscaper to help me with this particular project because there was a lot of digging and moving soil around. We took the excavated soil from within the rain garden and moved it to a berm that was later planted as well. So that sped up the process. Here you can see the finished excavation, mostly planted as well. There's about 650 plants put into the berm and the rain garden combined. And this is 2 months later on October 1st. You can see things like the purple coneflowers and a few other plants blooming already, blooming awfully late for their species because they were installed late. And then here it is in June the following year. So things are really filling in and establishing well. Then here it is on August 11th when we had a heavy thunderstorm. You can see the water flying out of that downspout and hitting those rocks. If I didn't have those rocks there, it would be eroding a lot of soil. So it's important to have those rocks there to absorb some of that energy. And then here it is the following day, plants looking very healthy and happy and blooming away the day after the thunderstorm. So I do have a video of that August 11th storm. So I'm going to change my screen here to show that. So you can see that water flying out of the downspout. You can see it's ponding in the garden. You can see it flowing away. And if you didn't know that was a rain garden, it would really just look like a flower bed. It's hard to tell that there's actually, in that case, probably a foot of water sitting at the base of the plants in the deepest area. That was about a 1¼ inch rainfall that time in maybe a half an hour. And that's about the minimum that it takes to fill up that rain garden all the way. One of the important things with rain gardens is to think about where that water is going to go if your rain garden fills up all the way. You don't want it going back toward your house or toward any structure. You want it to go away from the structure. So in my case, on the back side of the rain garden, opposite from where the water comes in, there is an engineered overflow spot where that water will then flow over into another area where there's a river birch tree and a few other plants that can tolerate a lot of water. And so it doesn't cause any further damage. If it does fill up all the way, it just overflows into another area where it can soak in. So I'll switch back to the presentation. Okay. Last year I had a neighbor come by and ask me, do you get bugs eating your plants? And the answer is yes. I do not worry about insects chewing on my plants. Gardeners often get stressed about small holes in leaves or munched edges on the leaves of their plants. These are just signs that your plants are sustaining life. In my opinion, it's a sign that your garden is working. It's a success. Those insects that are eating those plants are then eaten by birds and other critters. Those critters are then eaten by larger critters, and every animal from a bee to a bald eagle depend on a healthy native plant community to provide food for insects that move that energy up the food web. And a healthy garden has many natural predators that eat pest insects that munch on your plants. So yes, there will be a little bit of damage on your plants, but if it's a balanced garden, everything will kind of take care of itself. So we don't remove any insects, at least any native insects. We let Mother Nature kind of balance out the garden. Occasionally we do have things like Japanese beetles or oleander aphids on our milkweeds. These are non-native insects that can certainly be pests. They can be very abundant and they can completely defoliate some plants. So occasionally I will go out there and physically remove some of those, but any native insects I am delighted to see, and I do not remove them. This is an example of something I had last year, eating one of my golden Alexanders. These are often called parsley worms by vegetable gardeners. It's a caterpillar that feeds on anything in the carrot family. So carrots and dill, fennel, coriander, things like that. And there's also native plants that they'll eat, like golden Alexanders or angelica or cow parsnip, other species like that. Anything in the carrot family they'll feed on. So they may look at this parsley worm and consider it a pest and think, I need to get rid of these. But really, this makes me happy when I see one of these, because this is the larva of one of our most magnificent butterflies here in Wisconsin, the black swallowtail. So I don't want to remove them because I want to see the black swallowtails hanging around our property. As long as I provide the resources that it needs for its life cycle, it will hang around and bring us joy when we get to see it. This is a compilation of some of the butterflies that we saw in the rain garden last year. So these are photos from my house. And we saw everything from sulfurs to fritillaries to monarchs to various species of swallowtails. And now, if you'll allow me to rant for just a moment, this is a slide of major invasive plants that we deal with here in the upper Midwest. This is including things that are aquatic species, wetland species, and terrestrial species. And what I'm going to do now is highlight all of them in red that were introduced intentionally, mostly for gardening purposes. So you can see that as gardeners, we have a really important responsibility to plant things that are not invasive. And this includes water gardens and any other kind of garden out there. A lot of these plants were brought in intentionally so that we could plant them into various types of gardens. And then they escaped or they were released intentionally in some cases, and they start wreaking havoc on local ecosystems and outcompeting all kinds of natives. And in many cases, we get um, these areas of vegetation that are just dominated by these non-native plants. So it's not always that we know these things are going to become invasive when we're planting them, but the safest bet is just to use native plants whenever you can. We really don't see issues with native plants escaping from a garden and causing any ecological harm in nearby natural areas. So it's safest to use natives whenever you can, and not necessarily go looking for plants that are from halfway across the world when we're creating a new garden. We have over 1,000 plant species here in Wisconsin that are native. Not all of those are good for landscaping, they're not, but several hundred of them are. We still have to obey this gardener's rule that you put the right plant in the right place, whether it's native or not. The success of the garden depends on you choosing the right plants for the right place. Native plants are best to support pollinators and birds and other native wildlife. They require very little maintenance. They require no watering after they're established. Again, as long as you put the right plant in the right place. They don't need fertilizers. They don't need frost protection. You don't have to run out there in the late spring or the early fall and cover these plants up because they belong here. They can tolerate that frost. They require a lot less work on your part. And when you're designing a garden, any aspect of the design, whether it's heights and colors and different bloom times, it could be short plants for a border, erosion control species, or different accent plants. All of these aspects can be addressed with natives. When I'm talking about natives, I tend to define that as something that naturally grows in your state. You certainly can get more extreme with it, and some people are looking for plants that are native, the genetics of that plant are native to within 50 miles of their site or within their county. So they're looking for very locally sourced plants or seed. And again, I tend to think more on a state level when I'm talking about native plants. These are 3 examples of nice natives for landscaping purposes. The cardinal flower on the left is a lobelia species, native to floodplains and other moist areas around the state. It's a common cultivated species as well, so you'll find different cultivated varieties of that species in nurseries. The middle one is a blue spiderwort or Ohio spiderwort. Again, some of these Tradescantia species are cultivated and sold in nurseries, but it is a native plant. And on the right, of course, is a Rudbeckia. That's the common black-eyed Susan, and lanceleaf coreopsis in the background. Here's some other ones that are really nice for rain gardens in particular because they can tolerate a wide variety of moisture levels. The aster in the upper right is New England aster. This is a nice one for really anywhere within the rain garden because it can tolerate quite a range of moisture conditions. It does get kind of tall in moist areas, so it's one that you can cut back in early July and cause it to form more of a shorter, bushier form instead of a taller form. The lower left is bottle gentian, one of my absolute favorites. It just has such a striking blue color to it. And the top center is Joe Pyeweed. The lower center is blue flag iris. And on the right is Bebb's sedge, B-E-B-B-S. Carex bebbii is the Latin name. It's a nice, small, compact clump-forming sedge that gets typically 1.5 to 2 feet tall and works really well in moist sites, but it's somewhat versatile too. So it can reach down many feet to find water, and it can tolerate some somewhat dry conditions as well. Keep year-round interest in mind as well as the ecological value of those plants throughout the winter as well. Grasses and sedges that provide interesting seed heads throughout the winter are nice to have around for winter interest. They provide a lot of food for birds that are coming by in the wintertime. They're also eating berries and seed heads, of course, off of various other plants that you have in your garden design. And I always encourage people to leave dead stems standing until springtime. Around here, we see birds every day throughout the winter coming into the garden and feeding on seeds, taking shelter from cold winter winds within the plants. So it's really important habitat for those critters that are struggling to survive out there in the wintertime. I always clean up in the spring. Those dead stems, I remove them after the soil has thawed, but I wait until we get a very cold night of maybe 10 degrees or so. And that way the cold temperatures create a frozen crust on top of the soil that I can walk on the next morning, and I can get all those stems down. I can cut them to about 8 inches above the soil level, and I can walk in that site without trampling any root crowns, any new shoots of plants, or any of my uh, insect friends that are in the soil there. Many of our butterfly species overwinter in the stems of the plants or within rolled up leaves of the old plants, or the larvae or the pupae can actually overwinter in the soil at the base of their host plant. So I don't want to get in there and disturb everything and remove essentially my crop of butterflies for the following year. I wanted to mention the Healthy Lakes program as well. This is an opportunity for Wisconsin residents that live along a lake or a river. There is a 75% cost share up to $1,000 for things like rain gardens. There's a few different practices that are eligible, rain garden being one of them. The practice, the rain garden in this case, has to be maintained for 10 years if grant funds are used, but you can also just visit the healthylakeswi.com website for resources. It's open to the public, so you can find things like the garden plan you see here, or you can reach out to DNR and Extension Lake staff for site planning assistance or assistance in writing up a project for this program. These are the 5 different practices that are funded through the Healthy Lakes program. As I said, the rain garden is one of them, and shoreline planting is another one. The money from Healthy Lakes grants can be used to hire a contractor to do everything, or you can just go out and use that money to buy plants and put the garden in yourself. So you can get your kids and grandkids and neighbors out there to help you install this garden and get their hands dirty. This is my daughter helping me with a small planting last spring, and I'm always happy when she gets distracted by a butterfly flying by or a toad hopping by. This is sort of an ideal situation where she got distracted by a monarch and chased it down. Another common practice dealing especially with moisture issues in buildings is pairing rain barrels with rain gardens. So this is rainwater harvesting as well as moving water away from the structure down to a rain garden situation. Some municipalities will offer tax credits for both of these ideas. So if you have a rain barrel or multiple rain barrels or rain gardens, I believe at our old house where this photo was taken, the credit was $25 for a rain barrel and $50 for a rain garden. So it's not a lot, but it's something. And it incentivizes people to do the right thing and treat some of their stormwater on site. In this photo, you can see the rain barrel has a PVC outflow. I put in a 2-inch overflow pipe that ran down into the ground right in front of the barrel and then runs underground down to the rain garden itself. So this way I'm not only moving the water about 15 feet from the house, I'm also doing it underground so that everything is clean. I don't have to move anything when I mow the lawn. I just mow right over the top of it. And it's a very low maintenance way of directing that water away. So I'm a very big fan of low maintenance gardens, but high value gardens, ecologically speaking. This is another example where I had a 2-inch overflow from this barrel as well that runs under the walkway. So I did have to pull up the bricks of the walkway and put them back down. But then I ran about 40 feet of piping, the 2-inch piping, along the side of the house and then down into the backyard where we have a natural slope. And I emptied that into this rain garden. So we have blue flag iris here in the foreground, surrounded by some mint, and there's a bunch of asters, some jewelweed, rattlesnake master, some blazing stars, and a couple other plants in there. So we need a bunch of plants for the rain garden. Do we use plants, potted plants and plugs, or do we use seeds? Seeds are an inexpensive way to start gardens in general, but they don't work for rain gardens because the seeds can just get washed into the bottom of the rain garden or washed away. So they don't work because they tend to get washed away too quickly before they can really establish. So a rain garden is really a place to use plugs or small potted plants. I always use 2.5 by 3.5 inch potted plants for the rain gardens that I've put in because the results are very quick. This is an example of a butterfly garden that I helped put in at a local school here. This is not a rain garden. It is just a butterfly garden that's in a flat area next to the school. And we used all plugs. This is 300 square feet and 300 native plugs. So it's 1 plant per square foot. That's how I tend to plant gardens. I like planting them densely at 1 per square foot because they fill in quickly. And as they fill in quickly like that, they discourage weeds from growing in between them. So it's a decrease in maintenance as those weeds really don't get a hold within the garden itself. Some weeding has to be done around the outside, but very little within the garden itself. So here it is 3 months later, going from May to August. And you can see these plugs have established very well. They've got large root systems, they're flowering, they're doing extremely well. And if this was a rain garden situation, it would be very effective at soaking up a lot of water and preventing erosion from within the rain garden site due to all those plants occurring in there. This is a photo that was sent to me of a rain garden at Rhonda's house. Rhonda is one of the master gardeners within your group. She said that there is no longer erosion from runoff on her property here. She has a place of peace and tranquility, appreciated by all who see it. A rain garden is a natural solution to man-made problems. Rhonda had an erosion issue happening between 2 buildings and along this asphalt area here. So the rain garden was installed to capture that water and slow it down and allow it to soak in instead of having it cause erosion problems on her property there along the lakeshore. We have a choice between lakes and rivers and wetlands that look like this, with slimy algae globs and sometimes toxic blue-green algae like you see on the right photo, or we can have waterways that look like this, that have very little nutrient pollution in them. They have clear water, they have abundance of fish and wildlife and a diverse aquatic plant community within them. And really the answer is pretty simple. We need to decrease the amount of pollution on the landscape to begin with. And when we can't reduce it anymore, we try to contain it and filter it out through rain gardens and other simple practices like this. So with that, that's the end of the webinar. This webinar has been recorded and I will put it on the UW Extension Lakes YouTube channel within a couple of days here. So thank you very much for your attention.